The chamber is cold. Its walls are built of heavy stone, damp with the chill of an English autumn. A single window, narrow like the slit of an arrow, lets in a sliver of pale grey light. Outside, London is cloaked in clouds, the towers of Westminster rising like dark sentinels against the sky. In the centre of this room, on a table draped with crimson velvet, rests a crown. It is wrought of gold, studded with jewels that glitter in the candlelight. For the men who gather here, bishops, nobles, envoys, the crown is a symbol of triumph, of peace, of diplomacy achieved after decades of bloodshed. For you, a girl of only 6 years old, the crown is a weight you cannot carry. Your name is Isabella of Valois. In France, you were a child of the royal nursery, the daughter of King Charles VI and Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. There, your world was filled with stories told by nursemaids, games with your siblings, and the tender embrace of a mother who brushed your hair as you fell asleep. Here, in England, your childhood is stripped away. Today you are not simply a child. Today you are called Queen of England. The ceremony that unfolds is magnificent. Choirs sing, incense burns, the courtiers bow. King Richard II, a man of 29, stands tall and solemn beside you. He takes your hand, a hand so small that it disappears within his grasp, and leads you to the altar. The vows spoken are words you cannot fully comprehend. They bind to kingdoms, not to hearts. As the crown is lowered onto your head, it slips awkwardly, far too large. Its weight bends your neck, and you stagger for a moment. The hall erupts in applause, yet the sound is not for you. It is not for your happiness, not for your future. It is the applause of men congratulating themselves for a treaty sealed. For England, you are a fragile bridge to peace with France. For France, you are a guarantee of truce, a hostage draped in silk. For Richard II, you are a symbol to display, proof of his cunning diplomacy. For yourself, you are a little girl forced into a role you neither chose nor desired. That night, when the halls grow silent and the candles burn low, you curl into bed, clutching the doll you brought from France. Its stitching is rough, its fabric faded, but it is the only familiar thing left to you. Outside, the wind howls through the corridors, carrying with it the cries of a city that does not know your name. You whisper into the darkness, "Why me? Why must I wear a crown when I still long for my mother's embrace?" This is the beginning of the story of Isabella of Valois, crowned queen at 6, widowed at 10, remarried at 16, dead at 19. A girl swallowed by politics, erased from memory, remembered only as the forgotten Queen of England. To understand Isabella's story, we must first understand the turbulent world into which she was born. The year was 1389, when Isabella of Valois entered the world. Daughter of King Charles VI of France and Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, France was a kingdom battered by decades of conflict. The 100 Years' War with England had dragged on since 1337, a seemingly endless struggle over land, power, and legitimacy. Generations of soldiers had bled on French soil, villages had burned, peasants had starved, and entire provinces had lived under the constant shadow of invasion. But war was not the only enemy. France's own king, Charles VI, suffered from a cruel and unpredictable illness of the mind. At times he fled through his palace, shrieking that courtiers were trying to murder him. At others, he refused to bathe or change clothes for months. Once, he believed his body was made of glass and would shatter if touched. These episodes of madness left the kingdom fractured, controlled by rival factions of nobles, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, each eager to exploit the king's weakness. Into this chaos came Isabella, a child of fragile hope. She grew up in the splendid but uneasy court of the Valois dynasty. Chroniclers describe her as bright-eyed and delicate, with the fair hair of her Bavarian mother and the dignity of her French lineage. In the nursery, she played with dolls and listened to lullabies. But even there, whispers of politics seeped through the walls. She was not simply a child, she was a princess, and princesses in medieval Europe were never free. Meanwhile, across the Channel, England faced its own turmoil. King Richard II, grandson of the great Edward III, wore the crown. Richard's reign was unstable. As a boy king, he had endured the peasants' revolt of 1381. As a young man, he faced rebellious nobles who questioned his extravagance, his favoritism, and his authority. By the 1390s, his throne was anything but secure. He needed a grand gesture to silence his critics, to prove that he was not only King of England, but also a statesman capable of shaping Europe. The solution was marriage. If Richard could wed a French princess, peace might be secured between the two warring kingdoms. Such a union would silence his enemies and stabilize his reign. For France, exhausted by war and constrained by a king in madness, peace was equally precious. Thus, the negotiations began. The chosen bride was Isabella. At 6 years old, she was deemed suitable to serve as a bridge between nations. Her youth did not matter. In fact, it was convenient. She was malleable, innocent, unable to resist. Both courts saw her not as a girl but as a treaty in flesh and blood. In 1396, Isabella was sent across the Channel. The wedding was staged with breathtaking splendor, designed to impress both nations. At Calais, nobles from England and France gathered. Chroniclers described the banners of azure and gold, the trumpets that sounded, the processions of knights in gleaming armor. Isabella was clothed in cloth of gold, her tiny form almost lost within the folds. She was led down the aisle to meet her husband, Richard II, a man of 29, almost 5 times her age. The vows were spoken, though Isabella scarcely understood them. The marriage was not consummated. It was agreed that Richard would wait until she came of age. To Richard, she was not a wife in truth, but a symbol, a living guarantee of peace. To the French, she was a hostage dressed as a bride. To Isabella herself, she was a child torn from her home, bewildered by the grandeur that surrounded her. For a brief moment, the gamble seemed to work. The Treaty of Paris, signed alongside the marriage, promised 28 years of truce between England and France. Richard's critics in England grudgingly acknowledged the success. In France, Isabella's role was praised as a sacrifice for the good of the realm. But beneath the surface, tensions remained. No treaty could erase decades of hatred. No wedding could heal the wounds of war. And for Isabella, the price was immeasurable. Imagine the contrast. In France, she had run through gardens, laughed with siblings, and slept in the warmth of her mother's embrace. In England, she was placed on a throne beside a man she barely knew, surrounded by courtiers who spoke a language she could not understand. At ceremonies, she sat solemn and silent, her feet dangling above the floor, unable to reach the ground. Chroniclers noted this image: the child queen, her crown too large, her throne too high. She was both majestic and absurd, regal and tragic. Her presence was meant to symbolize unity, but in truth it revealed the cruelty of politics. Peace was purchased with her freedom. Stability was bought with her childhood. Isabella of Valois was not the first princess sacrificed to diplomacy, nor would she be the last. Anne of Bohemia, Richard's first wife, had also been used to secure peace years earlier. Later, Margaret of Valois in France would endure similar fate, married off for alliances. The pattern was clear. Royal daughters were not daughters at all. They were treaties, their bodies bartered like coin. Thus, at 6 years old, Isabella was thrust into a role too heavy for her shoulders. She had left behind the innocence of France and entered the theater of power. In the eyes of kings, she had become a queen. In her own heart, she remained a child who longed for home. Life at Westminster Palace dazzled foreign envoys and impressed chroniclers. Banquets glittered with silver plates, halls resounded with music, and processions displayed the wealth of the English crown. To the outside world, young Isabella seemed to live a dream, but behind the walls, the dream was hollow. For Isabella, the palace was not a home but a labyrinth of cold stone, suspicion, and solitude. A child in a foreign land from the moment she arrived, Isabella was surrounded by unfamiliar sounds. The English tongue, harsh and rapid, was incomprehensible to her. Courtiers bowed and smiled, but their words were indecipherable. She relied on her French attendants to translate, but even their presence reminded her she was in exile. She wrote letters to her mother in careful, childish script, begging to return home. But such letters were censored or intercepted. During ceremonies, she was seated beside Richard II, a man more than 2 decades her senior. Chroniclers remarked on the striking sight: a tall, regal king with a child queen at his side, her feet dangling above the floor. Some mocked Richard, calling the marriage unnatural, even absurd. Others whispered that peace built on such a fragile union could not last. Isabella, though too young to understand the politics, felt the sting of those whispers. The distance of a husband Richard too treated Isabella with courtesy, but also with detachment. Their marriage was not consummated, by agreement, until she came of age. In practice, this meant that she functioned more as an ornament than a partner. At banquets, Richard spoke to his nobles while Isabella sat silently. At public appearances, she was paraded as proof of the treaty with France, her solemn face a symbol of peace. In private, she was left to her attendants. Though Richard was not cruel, his distance deepened Isabella's loneliness. To her, he was not a husband, not even truly a guardian, but a figure looming far beyond her understanding. Whispers of unrest to peace with France did little to silence Richard's domestic critics. The English nobility resented his extravagance and his perceived arrogance. They whispered in the corridors, plotting rebellion. Isabella, wandering through the palace, caught fragments of conversations. The king spends too much. The people starve. The nobles will not stand for this. She may not have grasped the full meaning, but she understood enough to feel fear. The court grew tense. Friends of Richard vanished, exiled or executed. Nobles who once smiled at Isabella now looked at her with suspicion. She felt the weight of eyes upon her, judging her not as a child, but as the foreign queen who embodied a controversial treaty. The fall of Richard in 1399. Isabella's fragile world collapsed. Richard left for Ireland to suppress a rebellion, leaving the kingdom vulnerable. His cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, seized the moment. With support from discontented nobles, Henry marched into England, gathered allies, and claimed the throne as Henry IV. Richard was captured and imprisoned. Soon after, he was dead. Whether by starvation, neglect, or murder remains debated. Isabella, not yet 10 years old, found herself a widow in name. The man who had been her husband, her tenuous protector, was gone. A pawn once more, Henry IV faced the dilemma. What should be done with the child queen? To keep her in England was to hold a valuable hostage. To marry her to his son, the future Henry V, would legitimize his dynasty and claim continuity with Richard's reign. To send her back to France would risk losing leverage. The court buzzed with speculation. Some argued she should be remarried immediately to the new heir. Others whispered she was too young, too French, too bound to Richard's legacy. Isabella herself had no say. Imagine the terror of a child, grieving a husband she barely knew, overhearing plans to wed her again into the family of the man who had destroyed him. Her tears fell in private, stifled in her chamber. She clutched the doll she had carried from France, the last remnant of her childhood, and whispered prayers in a language few in England understood. The widow Chlita official title became Queen Dowager of England. To the public, it sounded grand. To Isabella, it was a cruel joke. She had never been a wife in truth, yet she was called a widow. She had barely learned to read and write, yet she was paraded as a symbol of legitimacy. At ceremonies she appeared draped in black, her face solemn, her figure fragile. Chroniclers noted her unusual gravity, her eyes downcast, her silence profound. She seemed, they said, like an old soul trapped in a child's body, a future uncertain in France. Her family pleaded for her return. In England, Henry IV hesitated. He knew she was valuable. As months turned into years, Isabella remained trapped, her days blurred together. Lessons in English she scarcely cared to learn. Endless prayers, enforced silence. Nights were worse. Alone in her chamber, she stared at the flickering candle and wondered if she would ever see her homeland again. This was Isabella's first true tragedy. Exalted as a queen, reduced to a pawn, made widow before she understood marriage. She was a child caught in the crossfire of kings. Her life written not in her own hand, but in the ink of treaties and the ambitions of men. And though she was still alive, her childhood was already gone. After Richard II's downfall, Isabella's existence in England became that of a prisoner dressed as a queen. Her days unfolded not in freedom but in confinement, her every gesture scrutinized, her every word monitored. Though her chambers gleamed with tapestries and precious ornaments, they were gilded bars of a cage from which there was no escape. The gilded cage outwardly, her apartments were splendid. She was lodged in palaces adorned with rich tapestries, heavy velvet curtains, and silver candlesticks that cast golden light at dusk. Servants attended her, bringing trays of food and fine clothing. To the casual eye, she lived in comfort, but luxury could not disguise captivity. Guards patrolled outside her doors. Messengers intercepted her letters. Visitors were carefully selected and monitored. She was not a guest of England. She was its hostage. Her toys from childhood were gone, deemed unsuitable for a queen dowager. Instead, she was surrounded by books of prayers and manuals of etiquette. Tutors drilled her in English phrases and religious observance. She sat through long lessons, stiff in her chair, the weight of expectation pressing down on her small frame. Each mistake invited scolding, each tear dismissal dotted ceremonies. She appeared in gowns heavy with jewels, the garments so burdensome that she could barely move. The nobles bowed to her title, but she knew their reverence was not for her, only for the treaty she represented. She smiled when commanded, stood silent when expected, and bowed her head as though her neck had been trained by chains. The widow-children title was cruelly ironic. Queen Dowager of England. At 8, she had never been a wife, yet she was declared a widow. Chroniclers described her in black mourning attire, her solemn face haunting in its gravity. Where other children laughed and played, Isabella sat in silence, her expression aged beyond her years. In public, she was displayed as a relic of Richard II, proof of a vanished regime. In private, she bore the loneliness of an exile. Even her attendants could not erase the distance. Their loyalty was practical, not personal. No one dared become her confidant. The politics of possession. Henry IV understood Isabella's value. Keeping her in England was useful leverage over France. Marrying her to his son, the future Henry V, could legitimize his dynasty. Sending her home might anger powerful factions in both countries. Thus, she remained suspended between fates, her future debated in council chambers while she languished in silence. In France, her family pressed for her return. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, urged her to carry herself with dignity, to remember that she bore the honor of France on her shoulders. For a child, such expectations were unbearable. She was not only hostage to England, but also burdened with the hopes of her homeland. Loneliness as constant companion. Her chambers echoed with emptiness. Peers, her own age, were absent. She had no companions for play. The corridors that stretched endlessly around her only emphasized her isolation. At night, she clutched the doll she had carried from France, its fabric worn, its face faded. To Isabella, the doll was more than a toy. It was the last remnant of her lost childhood, the silent friend who listened when no one else would. She sometimes scribbled letters to her mother, childish handwriting betraying both longing and fear. Yet many of these letters were never delivered, confiscated by watchful officials. Even innocent words like "I miss you" could be interpreted as weakness. Isabella learned quickly that silence was safer than speech. Survival through silence. So she adapted. She practiced the art of composure. She sat motionless in ceremonies, her small body rigid with discipline. She smiled faintly when required, never too much, never too little. She spoke softly, carefully, offering no more than what was demanded. In her silence lay her strength. Courtiers remarked on her solemnity. They said she looked like an old soul in a child's body, her gaze heavy with knowledge unfit for her years. She was only 9, but her demeanor suggested a woman twice that age. The toll of exile. The longer Isabella remained in England, the more her spirit withered. The days blurred together in a monotony of lessons and ceremonies. Nights brought no relief. The candlelight flickered in her chamber. The shadows lengthened, and she whispered prayers into the darkness. Would she ever return to France? Would she ever be free? She dreamed of gardens filled with flowers, of her siblings' laughter, of her mother's voice singing lullabies. But dreams faded upon waking, replaced by the heavy silence of captivity. The hope of return at last. In 1401, negotiations bore fruit. France demanded Isabella's return, arguing that she was too young to remain a pawn of England. After tense deliberations, Henry IV conceded. The girl who had been Queen of England was finally allowed to cross the Channel. Back to her homeland. The journey was both liberation and sorrow. As the ship sailed from Dover, Isabella stood at the railing, the wind whipping her hair. The sea stretched endless and blue. The gulls cried overhead. For the first time in years, she felt the thrill of freedom. Yet she carried with her scars. No, I could see. She had left France as a playful child. She returned as a solemn girl of 11. Her childhood stolen, her innocence bruised, her identity reshaped by captivity. On the Chronicles of Kings, this episode was a mere detail, a political arrangement resolved. But for Isabella, it was everything. It was the first true release, the fragile moment when hope returned. Still, she knew, the story of her suffering was not finished. When Isabella finally returned to France in 1401, the bells of Paris rang out to welcome her. Courtiers assembled, nobles bowed, and her mother, Queen Isabeau, embraced her daughter with tears. To France, Isabella was more than a child coming home. She was a living reminder of a fragile peace, a daughter reclaimed after years of humiliation at English hands. Yet the Isabella who returned was not the same child who had left at 6. She had grown solemn, thoughtful, and quiet. The laughter of her early years had been drained away by long months of captivity. She was only 11, but she carried herself like someone far older, her demeanor marked by caution and gravity. Chroniclers who saw her remarked on her maturity. She is serious beyond her years, as though time has bent her spirit before her body. For a few years, Isabella lived once more within the French court. There she experienced some respite. She was surrounded by her siblings, attended festivals, and heard again the familiar cadences of her mother tongue. But she could not escape what she had become, a political asset, a princess whose destiny was never hers to command. By 1406, the internal divisions in France deepened. The Burgundians and Armagnacs vied for power, while King Charles VI slipped further into madness. In such a climate, marriages were not matters of love, but of survival. Isabella, now 16, was called upon once again to serve. Her new husband would be Charles, Duke of Orleans. Charles was closer to her in age than Richard had been. He was cultured, fond of poetry, and destined to play an important role in the coming conflicts of France. For many, this union was promising. Isabella would finally live with a man nearer her years, perhaps with the chance of some personal happiness. But to Isabella, the match was simply another chain. The wedding of 1406 was splendid, staged with all the magnificence expected of the Valois dynasty. Nobles from across France gathered, and Paris streets filled with music and color. Isabella walked the aisle draped in silver and silk, a vision of regal beauty. Chroniclers praised her composure, her dignity, her grace, yet those who looked closely noted her eyes, calm, resigned, but with a sadness that no jewels could conceal. She had been a bride before, at 6. She had been widowed before she turned 10. Now, at 16, she was a bride again, not because she wished it, but because duty demanded it. Once more, her life was written not by her heart but by the ambitions of men. For a time, her marriage to Charles seemed gentler than her first. He was not unkind, and his interest in poetry and learning softened his image. Isabella moved within the Orleans household with quiet dignity, fulfilling her duties as Duchess. Yet peace remained fragile. France teetered on the edge of civil war, and Isabella's role was still that of pawn in a game larger than herself. Then, tragedy struck. In 1409, just 3 years after her wedding, Isabella's health failed. Most accounts suggest she suffered complications from childbirth. At 19, she died, her life extinguished before it had truly begun. Her death was the climax of a tragedy that had begun with her birth into royalty. Crowned queen at 6, widowed at 10, remarried at 16, dead at 19. Her life was a litany of roles imposed, never chosen. She had been child, queen, widow, duchess, and finally, a forgotten name in history's margins. Her funeral was modest compared to her weddings. There were no treaties sealed, no great speeches made. Chroniclers recorded her passing in brief notes, overshadowed by the wars and politics of her time. Her life had been used to buy peace, to bolster kings, to strengthen dynasties. In death, she was discarded, remembered only by a few lines in chronicles. The cruelest part of her tragedy was not merely her early death, but her erasure. Richard II's downfall was documented in detail. Henry IV's reign was chronicled. Henry V's victories would be celebrated for centuries. But Isabella, Queen of England at 6, Duchess of Orleans at 16, was all but forgotten. Thus the climax of her story was not a moment of glory, but a moment of silence. A girl who had once been the center of treaties and ceremonies was buried with barely a whisper. The halls that had once echoed her name fell quiet, and history turned the page without her. Isabella's tragedy was complete. She had lived in crowns too heavy for her head, in marriages too hollow for her heart, and in a world too cruel for her innocence. The death of Isabella of Valois in 1409 was not accompanied by bells, nor did it reshape the course of nations. Her passing was quiet, overshadowed by the thunder of armies and the roar of politics. Yet when we look back, the consequences of her life and death ripple far beyond her brief years. A vanished bridge of peace. When Isabella was first married to Richard II, she was intended as a bridge of peace between France and England. Her very presence was supposed to guarantee nearly 3 decades of truce. But with Richard's fall and Isabella's return to France, that bridge collapsed. Her early death erased any possibility of renewing such a fragile connection. Within a decade, hostilities resumed, and the conflict surged with renewed fury. By 1415, Henry V, the very man some had once suggested as Isabella's husband, invaded France and won his famous victory at Agen. The peace Isabella embodied as a child queen had crumbled into dust. The personal loss to France for France. Isabella's death was more than the end of a young life. It was the loss of a valuable figure in the dynastic struggle. As Duchess of Orleans, she might have played a role in stabilizing her husband's line. Instead, she left no surviving children to strengthen the Orleans cause. Within a few years, Charles of Orleans would himself be captured at Agincourt and held prisoner in England for decades. Isabella's absence left him without the support of a wife, who might have bolstered his position during these trials. Her family grieved, but their grief was swallowed by the political chaos of France. Her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, saw her daughter taken, traded, returned, and then buried before 20. Isabeau herself was vilified in later chronicles as weak and corrupt, and Isabella's death became one more silent wound in a family fractured by war and madness. The pattern of sacrifice Isabella's story was not unique, but it was across Europe. Royal daughters were bartered like currency. Anne of Bohemia had once been married to Richard II to secure peace. Catherine of Valois, Isabella's younger sister, would later be married to Henry V of England, another pawn in the long war. Even beyond France, the pattern repeated. Margaret of Austria, Isabella of Castile, Joanna of Naples. Their names were tied not to their choices but to the treaties their bodies sealed. Isabella's short life thus reveals a larger truth. In medieval diplomacy, the most fragile lives bore the heaviest burdens. Erased from history perhaps, the most haunting consequence of Isabella's life was her erasure. Chroniclers devoted endless pages to the battles of men, the ambitions of kings, the shifting of borders. Isabella, once a queen of England, received little more than passing mention. A few lines in Froissart's chronicles, scattered notes in French accounts, a name in genealogies. Why was she forgotten? In part because she never wielded power directly. She issued no decrees, commanded no armies, altered no laws. History, written largely by men for men, dismissed her as insignificant. But her insignificance was the product of the very structures that destroyed her. She was denied power, denied agency, denied even the chance to live long enough to make her mark. In truth, her life illustrates the silent costs of monarchy more vividly than any battlefield. Behind every treaty stood a girl like Isabella, sacrificed in the name of peace. Behind every alliance, a childhood was bartered. Isabella may not have left conquests or laws, but she left a warning, one ignored by her contemporaries, and two, often overlooked since, the shadow of what might have been. What might Isabella have become, had she lived? As Duchess of Orleans, she could have played a role in the coming French civil wars. She might have acted as mediator between factions, or as patron of the arts, alongside her poetic husband. She might have borne children who would shape dynasties. Instead, her voice was silenced, her possibilities erased. Her early death also removed a potential counterweight to the tragedies that followed. The Armagnac-Burgundian feud plunged France into civil war. Henry V's invasion shattered the fragile truce. Joan of Arc's rise decades later became necessary, partly because of the fractures that Isabella's generation could not mend. One cannot say Isabella could have prevented these calamities, but her absence left a void, consequences beyond her life. Ultimately, Isabella's legacy lies not in what she did, but in what was done to her. Her story demonstrates how personal suffering and political consequence are entwined. Her marriage brought temporary peace. Her widowhood symbolized its failure. Her death foreshadowed the wars renewed with brutal intensity. She was forgotten in chronicles, but not in the lived experiences of those who followed her path. When Catherine of Valois was married to Henry V, when Margaret of Anjou was sent to England decades later, the shadow of Isabella lingered, the reminder that queens could be forgotten, but the system that sacrificed them endured. The aftertaste of tragedy. Isabella's name may be obscure, but her consequences endure in the structure of history. The wars that resumed after her death scarred France and England for generations. The Valois line staggered through civil war. The English monarchy surged under Henry V, only to collapse again under his son. Isabella's story sits at the hinge of these events. Unacknowledged but essential, she was not simply forgotten because she mattered little, but because she mattered in ways that chroniclers preferred not to see. To acknowledge Isabella fully is to acknowledge the cruelty of a system that exalted and erased children in the same breath. The story of Isabella of Valois is brief, tragic, and almost invisible in the chronicles of her time. She never issued a decree, never commanded a battle, never stood at the head of armies. By the standards of medieval historians, she did nothing worth remembering. And yet, in her silence lies one of the clearest lessons of the age. Isabella was born into royalty, but royalty did not protect her. It consumed her. She was crowned queen at 6 to serve as a treaty, widowed at 10 when that treaty collapsed, married again at 16 for the ambitions of another faction, and dead by 19, her body broken, her life spent. At every stage, she was used to build peace or alliances, but she herself was never allowed peace or choice. Her legacy, then, is not one of achievements, but of testimony. She stands as a reminder of the countless girls across history whose childhoods were stolen by crowns too heavy for their heads. In her, we see the hidden costs of monarchy, the quiet tragedies that do not appear in chronicles of battles and kings. To remember Isabella is to resist forgetting the powerless. It is to recognize that history is not only the story of those who won wars, but also of those who suffered silently. She is called the forgotten Queen of England, but by speaking her name, by telling her story, we defy that forgetting. Her life is a mirror of unchecked power, of innocence lost, of treaties bought with children's tears, and her lesson is clear. The greatness of a nation must be measured not only by its victories, but by its compassion for the most vulnerable.